Welcome back to the channel, dear listeners. Before we begin today's story, if you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications because we bring you new supernatural romance stories every week. And trust me, you do not want to miss a single one. And if you have ever whispered something to the night sky and wondered, even for just one breathless second, whether something ancient and enormous was listening, then this story was made for you. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and let the story take you somewhere the moonlight never quite fades. Part 1. The Girl Who Talked to the Moon. The night Lyra Ashvale turned 8 years old, she climbed to the highest rock behind her family's den and looked up at the full moon with the particular kind of hunger that only the very lonely understand. She did not howl, as young wolves were supposed to do on nights like this, surrounded by their packmates in a chorus of belonging. She whispered. She pressed her small fingers against the cold stone, and she told the moon everything. The way her mother looked through her sometimes as if she were not quite there. The way the older pups never chose her for their games. The way she felt like a word in a language no one around her spoke. She whispered it all into the silver-soaked darkness, not expecting an answer. Not really, but needing to say it somewhere, to something, before it crushed her from the inside out. What she felt in response was not a voice. It was more like warmth, distant and vast and impossibly gentle, like being noticed by something so large it could have chosen not to notice her at all. And yet it did. Lyra did not tell anyone about that warmth. She understood, with the animal instinct that children have before the world teaches them to doubt their own perceptions, that some things are only yours if you keep them secret. She kept talking to the moon for the next 8 years. By the time she was 16, the other members of Clan Ashvale had already begun to pull back from her in the particular way that werewolf communities pull back from those they consider incomplete. Lyra had not manifested her secondary nature clearly enough for anyone's comfort. She was not a strong omega, not a recognizable beta, certainly not a whiff of alpha. She was something imprecise, and therefore something uncomfortable. And the elders who examined the strange silvery mark on her left shoulder blade, a mark that looked like a crescent moon split down the middle by a single jagged line, could not agree on what it meant, except that it meant something wrong. Elder Corvus, the oldest and most respected of her clan, made the declaration on a cold autumn evening with the rest of the pack assembled in the great clearing. He spoke the words of severance with the practiced calm of a man who had done difficult things many times before and had learned that distance made them easier. The mark on Lyra's skin was not a blessing from the moon, he said. It was an aberration, a disruption to the natural order. A wolf who could not be categorized could not be trusted, and a wolf who could not be trusted could not remain. Lyra did not cry in the clearing. She saved that for later, alone in the forest, with no witness but the moon. She whispered her humiliation and her grief and her rage into the dark air, and the warmth came again, steadier than before, and this time accompanied by something she could only describe as patience, as if whatever was listening had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it waiting for her. She had to believe in that patience. It was the only thing she had left. For 8 more years, Lyra lived in the northern forests, in the borderlands between claimed territory and wild land that no established pack wanted badly enough to defend. She was a skilled hunter, quick and silent, and the years of solitude had sharpened her senses in ways she did not fully understand. She healed faster than she should have. She moved more quietly than should have been possible. Animals that should have fled her presence sometimes came closer, as if drawn by the same gravitational pull that she had always felt from the moon. She built a small shelter near an ancient stream and she survived. And on full moon nights she climbed to the highest point she could find and she talked to the sky. And the sky always answered with that same vast, patient warmth. She was 24 years old when everything fell apart. The hunters arrived on a night when the moon was only a thin sliver, when the dark pressed close and the forest held its breath. There were 6 of them, wearing the charcoal and copper markings of Clan Stonevar, a pack known for its aggression and its particular hatred for unclaimed wolves living on territory they considered transitionally theirs. Lyra heard them before she saw them, heard the deliberate weight of their footsteps, the coordinated silence of a hunting formation, and she was on her feet, and moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. She ran. She had run from Clan Stonevar hunters twice before, brief encounters that ended with her successfully losing them in the tangle of the deep woods, where she knew every root and hollow, and they did not. But this time was different. This time they had brought a tracker, someone who knew how to read the disturbances that even the most careful wolf left in the old natural world, and they had been studying her movements, probably for weeks. Every route she tried to take, they were already ahead of her. Every direction she turned, she found them waiting. She ran north. She had never gone north. No one went north. The Grey Mountains were not forbidden in the way that laws were forbidden, with written penalties and enforcers. They were forbidden the way that the deep ocean is forbidden, by the simple overwhelming evidence of what they were and what anything, small enough to drown, would feel upon entering them. The pack elders of every clan in the region agreed on almost nothing except this. The Grey Mountains belonged to something older than packs, older than hierarchies, older than the civilization of werewolves as any living creature understood it. Whatever lived in the Grey Mountains had been there before any of them existed, and would be there after all of them were gone, and the only mercy was that it stayed there, dormant and distant, and asked nothing of the world below. Lyra ran into the Grey Mountains with 6 hunters at her back, and the cold certainty that whatever waited ahead of her could not be worse than what waited behind. She was, as it turned out, both right and spectacularly wrong. The moment she crossed the invisible boundary where the mountain forest changed character, where the trees grew taller and closer, and the silence took on a different quality, like the silence inside a cathedral, rather than the silence inside a cave, the hunters stopped following her. She heard them stop, heard the sudden collective pause of 6 bodies hitting an instinctive wall of resistance, heard one of them make a sound that was not quite a word, and then heard nothing but the mountain. She kept running for another mile before she allowed herself to slow, and then she stood in the middle of an ancient forest that smelled like time itself, her breath coming in great visible clouds in the frozen air, her heart hammering against her ribs. And she looked up through the canopy at the thin sliver of moon, and she whispered, "I hope you know what I just did." The warmth that answered was the strongest she had ever felt. It moved through her like something finally clicking into place, like a door that had been stuck for years suddenly swinging open, and underneath it, mixed into it, was something new, something that felt less like warmth and more like the moment before lightning strikes, charged and enormous and pointed directly at her. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against a tree that was wider than her shelter had been, and she watched the darkness and she breathed, and something in the darkness breathed back. Part 2. The one who slept beneath the stone. Before there were clans, before there were alphas and omegas, and the elaborate social mathematics of pack hierarchy, there were the primordials. This is not legend, though it has become legend the way that all true things become legend when enough time passes and enough people stop believing in them out of convenience. The primordials were the first wolves, the original expression of what the moon intended when it breathed life into the world and asked for something that would run beneath it, something that would howl back. They were not larger than modern werewolves simply in body, though that too. They were larger in the way that concepts are larger than their definitions, the way that fire is larger than any single flame. There had been several of them once. Now there was one. Kale Dawnfang had not chosen to be the last of his kind. It had happened the way most profound losses happen, gradually and then all at once, across centuries that blurred together like watercolors in rain. His brothers and sisters had not died dramatically. They had faded, worn thin by a world that was evolving past the need for them, or perhaps past the ability to sustain them. One by one they had gone to ground, retreated into the deep places of the world, and simply not come back. Kale had waited for each of them, patient as stone, and when the waiting became its own kind of knowledge, he had done what the moon asked him to do in the wordless language they had spoken since before language existed. He had slept. He slept in the heart of the Grey Mountains. in a chamber of rock that the mountain had grown around him over centuries, and he dreamed the way that very old things dream, not in images or narratives, but in sensation, in the memory of wind and the memory of running, and the memory of voices that no longer existed anywhere in the world except inside him. He was not unconscious. He was waiting. The moon had told him, in that wordless language, that the waiting had a purpose, that there would come a time when the world would need what he was again, when the elaborate civilizations that had grown up in his absence would have built something wonderful and broken and in need of the kind of intervention that only a primordial could provide. He had been waiting for a very long time. The first thing that woke him was not a sound. It was a feeling, a particular quality of attention that had been directed at the moon consistently, with a sincerity so complete that the moon itself had begun to redirect some of its regard back down toward a single point in the northern forests. Cale had been aware of this for years, in the distant dreaming way that one can be aware of a sound in another room while asleep. A small voice, a lonely voice, a voice that whispered things to the night sky with the kind of raw honesty that most creatures only achieve when they believe no one is listening. He listened. He could not help it. Sincerity at that magnitude was rare enough to be remarkable even through the fog of centuries of sleep. He began to wake slowly, the way that mountains wake in spring, which is to say that from the outside it looked like nothing was happening until suddenly everything was different. He became aware of the forest above him, of the particular signature of the ancient trees, of the way the cold air moved through the upper reaches of his territory. He became aware of the hunters crossing into the lower forest, of their intent, which to him was as readable as text, and he became aware of the small wolf running ahead of them, the one whose scent reached him even through rock and earth and the particular density of a primordial sleeping space, a scent that made every ancient instinct in his body snap to attention simultaneously. She smelled like moonlight, not metaphorically, not in the way that romantic descriptions reach for celestial imagery to convey beauty. She literally carried the particular electromagnetic signature of reflected lunar light, woven into her chemistry in a way that was so far outside the parameters of normal werewolf biology that Cale would have assumed he was still dreaming, except that he was now awake enough to know he was not. The mark she carried, the split crescent that her clan's elders had called an aberration, was not an aberration at all. It was a seal, a very old seal, placed on a bloodline generations ago by the moon itself, meant to identify and protect the one who would eventually carry it correctly. She had carried it correctly from the moment she was born. The elders simply lacked the vocabulary to recognize what they were looking at. Kel felt her cross into his territory the way you feel a key turn in a lock you did. Not know was locked. He felt the hunters stop at the boundary, stopped not by any active effort on his part, but simply by the passive radiation of what he was, the way that deep ocean stops most boats not through violence, but through the simple reality of depth. He felt the small wolf slow from a run to a walk, felt her put her back against one of his oldest trees, felt her look up at the sky and whisper something to the moon. He felt the moon direct her attention down, as if to say, "Look, here. He is, I told you. Be patient. Look." Kyle opened his eyes for the first time in 347 years, and the stone around him cracked with the subtle pressure of his attention, returning fully to the physical world. He did not move immediately. He lay in the dark beneath the mountain, and he breathed and he listened to the small wolf breathe above him. And he thought about how to approach this particular situation without terrifying her into something irreversible. He was, after all, a primordial. He was old enough to know that power without care was just damage at scale. He would have to be very, very careful. Part 3. The First Meeting. Lyra's first sign that something was changing in the mountain was the temperature. She had expected the gray mountains to be cold, and they were. But as dawn approached on her first sleepless night within them, a warmth began to emanate from the ground beneath her, subtle at first, then increasingly present, as if the earth itself was waking up and generating heat as a byproduct. The ancient tree at her back seemed to lean toward it, and several small animals that had been keeping their distance from her throughout the night crept closer, drawn by the warmth, the way animals always move toward the safe side of any equation. Then the ground shook, not violently, not with the chaotic energy of an earthquake, but with the deep, rhythmic, intentional resonance of something enormous moving beneath the surface. Once, twice, 3 times, like footsteps, but from something so large that the footsteps were transmitted through solid rock rather than air. Lyra was on her feet, every nerve in her body firing. She scanned the forest around her and saw nothing that her eyes could name as threat, and yet every biological alarm she possessed was ringing at a frequency she had never experienced before. This was not the fear she felt when the Stonevar hunters were closing in. This was the fear you feel standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. A fear that is also, confusingly, curiosity at its most extreme. The ground cracked 30 meters in front of her. It was not a violent crack, but a deliberate one, the way you might break the seal on something that has been closed for a very long time, and from the crack a hand emerged, followed by an arm, followed by a shoulder, followed by the slow and enormous arrival of a being who did not so much rise from the earth as separate from it, the way that a cliff face is not separate from the mountain until the moment the light hits it at the right angle. He was tall. That was the first thing, because it was the most immediately quantifiable thing. In his human form, and she could tell this was his human form, not by how human he looked, but by the effort she could see it represented. He stood somewhere around 2.5 meters, with a build that suggested his body had been designed to contain forces that standard anatomy was simply not equipped to express. His hair was dark with traces of silver at the temples. Not the silver of age, but the silver of something older and stranger than aging. His eyes, when they found hers across the 30 meters of forest floor between them, were the color of the sky precisely at the moment before dawn. That impossible gray blue that lasts for only seconds and is never the same twice. He looked at her with an expression that she spent a long time afterward, trying to describe accurately, and settled. Finally on this. He looked at her. The way you look at something you have been told will arrive, but whose arrival still manages to be astonishing. Neither of them spoke. The forest held its breath. Lyra's wolf, that deeper animal layer of herself that processed the world in scent and instinct rather than language and logic, went very still in a way that was completely different from the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of recognition, which is fear's opposite, the particular quiet of a creature encountering something that every layer of its being identifies as fundamental rather than foreign. She wanted to run. She also could not imagine running. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and neither resolved into the other. He spoke first. His voice was the thing that she had not been prepared for, which was foolish in retrospect, because she had been unprepared for all of it, and she might as well have been unprepared in a consistent way. His voice was low and resonant in a frequency that she felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears, and he spoke without any of the aggression or dominance display that alphas typically used as their opening position, which was itself so unusual that it took her several seconds to process what he was actually saying. "You are safe here," he said. "The ones following you cannot enter this territory. You have my word on that, though I understand my word means nothing to you yet." Lyra's throat worked around several possible responses. What emerged was, "What are you?" Not a question. A demand for clarification dressed as a question. Something shifted in his expression that she could not name. It was not amusement, not quite, but it was adjacent to it, like the shadow of a smile that had decided to be responsible and stay home. "I am what I am," he said, which was so unhelpful that she nearly said so out loud. "And what I am has no convenient modern category. Your elders would call me a myth. The moon would call me something older than language. I have been called Kale Dawnfang, by those who knew me well enough to name me at all." Lyra stared at him. "The primordial," she said, not because she fully believed it, but because it was the only category her knowledge possessed that could theoretically contain what she was looking at. The old stories, the ones told to wolf pups as a combination of history and warning, mentioned the primordials in the way that all stories mention things that are too large to look at directly, briefly, and with significant omission. "Yes," he said. "You've been asleep," she said. "Yes, for 3 centuries, 347 years," he said, with the precision of someone who had counted. Lyra took a slow breath. She looked at him, at the ground that still radiated warmth from the chamber he had emerged from, at the crack in the earth that was already beginning to close the way that living things heal. She looked back at his eyes, that strange pre-dawn gray, blue, and she said the thing that came most naturally to her, which was the truth. "I would like to know why I am here," she said, "and I would like you to tell me without the kind of destined mate speech that makes it sound like I do not have a choice in whatever is happening, because I have had enough of not having choices to last me several lifetimes. And whatever you are, whatever this is, I need it to begin honestly, or I need to leave." The thing that moved across his face this time was not the shadow of a smile. It was a real one, brief and startled and entirely genuine, and it transformed his face in a way that made him look, for just that moment, less like something geological and more like something that had once been very young and had never entirely lost the memory of it. "That," he said, "is perhaps the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me since before the Renaissance. I will tell you everything, but first, will you let me feed you? You ran a great distance last night, and you have not eaten." Lyra blinked. It was such an ordinary concern, so precisely domestic against the backdrop of everything else, that she almost laughed. "Almost. You have food?" she said. "You have been asleep for 3.5 centuries. The mountain provides," he said simply, "for those who know how to ask it." She should not have trusted that. She knew she should not have trusted that. She went with him anyway, and as she fell into step beside him, the silver mark on her shoulder blade pulsed with a warmth that felt, unmistakably, like the warmth she had been feeling from the moon her whole life. Just closer now. Much, much closer. Part 4. The weight of what was hidden. And here, dear listeners, we have to pause for just a moment, because I know you are feeling exactly what I intended you to feel. That combination of wonder and apprehension, and the very particular kind of romantic anticipation that comes from watching two people who are clearly made for each. Others try to navigate the distance between them with honesty instead of shortcuts. If you are loving this story so far, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know, and leave me a comment telling me which character you connect with more. Lyra with her hard-won independence and her refusal to accept any version of her life she has not chosen, or Cale with his ancient patience and the loneliness of 3 centuries of waiting. I read every single comment. Now, let us continue. He fed her from the mountain, which turned out to mean that he knew where every edible thing in his territory grew and had been growing, undisturbed, for centuries. There were plants that had no names in modern herbalism, and berries that tasted like something between fruit and memory, and a clear stream that ran from deep beneath the rock and was cold enough to ache and pure enough to make ordinary water seem like a compromise. She ate without speaking much, and he sat across from her and watched her eat with the particular attention of someone who has not had company in a very long time and is recalibrating to the reality of another presence. When she was finished, she looked at him and said, "Now talk." He talked. He told her about the primordials, about what they were and what the world had been before the pack system evolved, before alphas and omegas and the social hierarchies that had organized werewolf life for the past several centuries. He told her, without nostalgia and without judgment, simply describing the architecture of a world she had never seen and could barely imagine. In the beginning, he said, there was only the moon's intention and the wolves who embodied it, and the relationship between them was direct and unmediated, a conversation rather than a chain of command. Then he told her about the seal. 350 years ago, before he had gone to sleep, he had understood that the world was changing in ways he could not stop and perhaps should not try to stop. The pack system was emerging, and while it imposed hierarchies that had not existed before, it also created communities, belonging, structure, protection for those who might otherwise be alone. He had seen both its promise and its flaw in the same moment, understood that the system would eventually corrupt itself. would harden around power and forget the purpose that power was supposed to serve. So he had done something that cost him considerably. He had gone to the moon and asked for a gift to be placed in the world. A gift that would remain dormant until the corruption he foresaw had reached the point where it needed to be addressed. The gift was simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. A bloodline marker that would identify in each generation one individual whose nature contained the precise combination of qualities needed to serve as a bridge between the old world and the new. Someone who would be born into the broken system and therefore understand it from the inside. Someone who would be rejected by it and therefore be free from its constraints. Someone who would carry the moon's direct attention in their very cells without being consumed by it. Someone who would be Lyra's grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. And eventually, after the gift had refined itself through generations of waiting for exactly the right expression, someone who would be Lyra. Lyra sat very still while he told her this. She had learned to keep her reactions private years ago, to process internally before anything showed on her face. And she was grateful for that training now because what she was processing was significant. She thought about being 8 years old on a rock and whispering her loneliness into the sky. She thought about the warmth that had answered her. She thought about 16 years old and the declaration of severance and the long walk into the forest alone. She thought about a moon that had been preparing her for this, her whole life, that had answered her every whisper with patience, that had allowed her to be rejected and hurt and isolated because those experiences were the crucible in which the particular version of herself that this moment required had been forged. She did not know yet whether to be grateful or furious. "The mark on my shoulder," she said, her voice careful and even. "The one my elders called an aberration." "Is not an aberration," he confirmed. "It is the seal fully expressed. It has been in your bloodline for generations, in a dormant form that prevented those who carried it from manifesting it clearly enough to trigger its full activation. You are the first in your line to carry it correctly, which means you are the one it was placed for." "What does it do?" she said. He took a breath that was slow and measured. "It gives you direct access to the moon's channel," he said. "Not the filtered, diluted version that normal werewolves experience through their pack bonds or their alpha connections. Direct, unmediated. You have been doing it your whole life without realizing it." Lyra thought about the warmth. She thought about every full moon night, and every dark moon night, and every night in between, when the world felt too heavy, and she had talked to the sky, and the sky had talked back. "I thought I was just," she started, and stopped. I thought I was coping with loneliness," she said finally. "I thought I was making meaning from emptiness." "You were in conversation with the source of all werewolf existence," he said gently, "and it has been answering you your entire life, because you were the only one in several generations who was listening without an agenda." Something tightened in her chest. Not painfully, like a door opening in a direction she had not expected. "And you," she said, "where do you fit into all of this?" He looked at her steadily. "I am the anchor," he said. "The seal exists to identify the bridge. I am what the bridge connects to. What was placed in your bloodline was not placed alone. It was placed in relation to something it was meant to eventually find. The warmth you have felt from the moon your whole life is partially mine, filtered through the lunar channel. Because I have been aware of you for years, and the moon has been carrying the connection between us in both directions." Lyra breathed. She breathed very carefully and deliberately, and thought about what he had just said. "So, the moon," she said, "has been telling you about me." "Yes, and telling me about you." "In essence, for years." "Yes." She looked at him. At the pre-dawn eyes and the face that had never quite lost its memory of youth, and the body that contained forces she could not measure. She looked at him and said, "And what happens now? According to the plan that was made for us 350 years before either of us was in our current form?" He answered this carefully. She could see him choosing. His words with the kind of deliberateness that suggested he had thought about this conversation for a long time, and had very strong feelings about how it should go. According to the original structure, he said, a mate bond would form, and the two of us would work in concert to begin addressing the corruption in the pack system. That is the intended outcome. However, she echoed, I am 347 years removed from the world above this mountain, he said. I do not know the current state of the system, the specific forms the corruption has taken, the players involved, or what interventions would actually be effective versus what would simply create different problems. And I am aware that I am sitting across from a woman who has been hurt by the very system I am supposed to help her reform, and asking her to simply trust in a plan that was made for her without her consent is, he paused. It is not something I am willing to do. Lyra stared at him. The bond cannot be forced, he continued. A primordial bond requires both participants to choose it with full knowledge and full agency. That is not a limitation I resent. It is a principle I believe in. You came to this mountain because you were running from a threat. You deserve to understand everything before you make any decision about what comes next. And if what comes next is that you decide to leave and handle your life entirely outside of any plan the moon or I have conceived, then I will ensure you have a safe place to go and whatever resources I can provide to help you, and I will return to the mountain. He said it quietly and with complete sincerity. And Lyra, who had spent 8 years learning to detect the exact texture of insincerity in every form it could take, believed him. This was, in some ways, the most terrifying thing that had happened to her since the night the Stonevar hunters started chasing her, because she could manage hostility, and she could manage manipulation, and she could manage indifference. She did not have very good tools for managing someone who was exactly what he said he was. I am not leaving, she said, and surprised herself with how certain it came out. I came here running from something. I want to stay long enough to figure out what I might be running toward. The pre-dawn eyes warmed by several degrees. That, he said, is the only answer I had hoped for without allowing myself to expect. Part 5. What the mountain teaches. She stayed. The first week was the strangest of her life, which was saying something significant given the life she had lived. The Grey Mountains were not a comfortable place in the ordinary sense. They were a demanding place, full of silence that required something from you, and ancient trees that seemed to pay attention, and a quality of air that made every breath feel like a decision. But they were also, unexpectedly, a safe place. The specific safety of somewhere that did not require you to be anything other than exactly what you were. Kyle taught her the territory. He did it with the patience of something that has had centuries to understand, that learning cannot be rushed. Walking beside her as she learned which roots were edible and which were medicinal, and which would make her exceptionally unwell, showing her the patterns of the mountain seasons that ran slightly out of sync with the world below, explaining the geography of his domain with the quiet pride of someone sharing something precious. She noticed that he never led. He walked beside her, placed himself slightly to the side and behind when terrain made single file necessary so that she had the clearer view of what was ahead, positioned himself consistently in ways that gave her access and information rather than taking it for himself. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, silently and thoroughly, filing it alongside the other things she was learning about him. He was lonely, she recognized, the particular shape of that loneliness, because she had lived inside her own version of it for years, and it looked the same, even in someone who had chosen his isolation, rather than having it forced upon him. 3 centuries of silence left marks. She saw them in the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence, and looked at her as if still recalibrating to the reality of another voice in the space. The way he touched the ancient trees as he passed them, with a familiarity that was also a kind of substitute for the companionship they were not. The way he listened when she talked with the absolute focused attention of someone who had not had anyone to listen to for longer than most civilizations last. She told him about her life, in pieces, on walks and over meals, and in the evenings when they sat near the thermal vents that kept the mountain's heart warm, and she talked to the sky through the canopy the way she always had. She told him about the clan, and the rejection, and the 8 years of building a life from the materials the world had left her after taking everything else away. She told him without self-pity, because she had worked very hard to move beyond self-pity into something more useful. But she told him with honesty, and he received what she told him with a gravity that never tipped into pity, and a respect that felt like the rarest thing she had been offered in her life. He told her about the world before, not to romanticize it. He was careful about that, and she appreciated the care. The old world had its own violences and its own injustices. The primordials themselves had not been without flaws. Power at that scale was always in danger of distance from the beings it theoretically served. But there were things that had existed before the hierarchy solidified that were worth grieving, worth remembering as possible, worth considering as blueprints for what could exist again in different form. The connection between wolves and the moon had been direct. He explained. Every wolf had access to that channel, not just through pack bonds and alpha hierarchies, not filtered through layers of social structure that favored some and diminished others. The moon's regard was not a resource to be controlled and distributed according to someone's position in a dominance hierarchy. It was a relationship, personal and direct, and available to every individual who chose to cultivate it. Lyra thought about that as she sat on the mountain's highest accessible point. On the night of the full moon, and the warmth came down as strong and vast and patient as it always had, and she understood for the first time what she had been doing her whole life without language for it. She had been maintaining the original relationship in the absence of the system that had replaced it, like a plant that grows toward light through whatever opening is available when the usual windows are blocked. "Is this what it was like?" she asked the sky. And Kyle, who was sitting a respectful distance away and watching her with the careful attention of someone who knows they are witnessing something significant, understood the question. "Not exactly," he said. "It was louder when there were many voices in it, but the quality was the same. That recognition, that sense of being known." She pressed her hand against the cold stone beneath her and felt it warm under her palm. The mountain's own answer to the moon's above, and something in her settled that had been unsettled. Since she was 8 years old and climbed a rock to talk to the sky because there was no one else to talk to. "Tell me about the corruption," she said. "Tell me specifically. What is happening in the packs below?" He did not know specifics, as he had said, but he knew patterns, and patterns were what they had. She filled in the specifics from her 8 years of living on the margins and watching the pack system from the outside, from the perspective of someone it had ejected. And between her observation and his structural knowledge of how these things tended to develop, they began to build a picture. The Omega classification had been the most severely distorted. What had begun as a simple designation for wolves whose nature inclined toward nurturing, supporting, and connecting, had been hardened over generations into a caste, a class of beings considered inherently inferior and therefore inherently controllable. The worst pack structures used their omegas as resources, as status, symbols, as political currency in the form of mate arrangements, as labor. Even the best of them rarely managed to treat their omegas as fully realized individuals whose gifts were valuable rather than whose compliance was required. The alpha designation had been correspondingly distorted. What had begun as a recognition of wolves whose nature inclined toward leadership, protection, and decision-making had become an ideology of inherent superiority that justified almost any behavior, created structures of accountability so weighted toward alpha interests that genuine harm was rarely addressed, and produced generation after generation of wolves who understood power as something to be possessed and deployed rather than something to be exercised in service of others. The primordial bond, Kale explained, had always existed as a corrective mechanism, not to override the pack system, but to introduce something into it that it could not generate from within its own logic, a perspective that existed outside the hierarchy by nature, a power that could not be fitted into the hierarchy's categories and therefore could not be contained by them, and a bond between two beings who had come to each other through honesty rather than dominance, through choice rather than compulsion, and whose relationship would therefore model something different from the ground up. "We are supposed to be an example," Lyra said. and the flatness in her voice made him look at her carefully. "Among other things," he said. "I spent my entire life being made an example of," she said. "The wolf who did not fit, the aberration, the thing that could not be categorized, and was therefore removed." She was quiet for a moment. "I am not interested in being an example of anything. I am interested in being a person who makes choices and lives with them. Those are not incompatible things," he said quietly. "In fact, I would argue the second makes the first possible. An example that is not built from. Genuine choice and genuine personhood is just a performance, and performances do not change systems. What changes systems is someone who refuses the terms being offered and proposes better terms from a position of authentic power." Lyra considered this for a long time. "You are very good at saying things that are difficult to argue with," she said. "I have had 3.5 centuries to think about how this conversation might go," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and she saw the surprise and pleasure that moved through his face at the sound of it. She looked at him and felt the warmth of the moon, and the warmth of the mountain, and the new warmth that had been building between them for 2 weeks of honest conversation and slow trust. And she said, "I am not ready to decide anything, but I am not running from this. That is all I would ask," he said. "Are you still with me, dear listeners? Because things are about to shift in a way that is going to require everything both of them have built so far. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, now is a perfect moment, because the story is moving into its most intense phase, and you will not want to miss a single word of what comes next. Leave a comment below telling me what you think Lyra's greatest strength is. I have my own answer, but I want to hear yours first. Part 6. The world reaches up. 3 weeks into her time in the Grey Mountains, the world below reached up and grabbed them. It came in the form of a young wolf, barely more than a pup in the way Lyra measured age now, who had somehow navigated enough of the boundary to cry out before the mountain's passive resistance stopped him. He was from Clan Morrow, a mid-sized pack about 40 miles south, and he was injured, and he was terrified. And what he said when Lyra came to the boundary and crouched near enough to hear him changed every calculation they had been making. Clan Stonever had not been hunting Lyra out of territorial aggression. They had been hunting her because someone had told them who she was, what her mark meant, and had offered them significant resources in exchange for her capture. The someone was an alliance of 3 dominant alpha clans who had, in the years since Kale's absence, formed a confederation that was consolidating power over the entire northern region. They called themselves the Triad, and they had been systematically eliminating or absorbing any pack that resisted their expansion. And they were very, very interested in the idea that a primordial bond might be reforming, because a primordial bond would represent a power structure that their entire system was built to prevent. The Triad's authority rested on control of the alpha hierarchy, on the chain of dominance that kept every wolf in the region oriented toward them as the ultimate source of social legitimacy. A primordial bond answered to no hierarchy. It drew its power directly from the moon, and if what the old stories said was true, it could, in theory, undo every artificial structure built on top of the original relationship between wolves and the source of their nature. They were, to put it plainly, afraid. Lyra looked at the young wolf crumpled at the boundary of the mountain, and then looked back toward where she knew Kale was, somewhere deeper in the trees, and she felt the moment her decision crystallized. Not with drama, with the quiet finality of something that had been true for a while being acknowledged. She brought the young wolf inside, not to the deep mountain, not to Kale's inner territory, but to the boundary's edge where the passive warmth of the mountain's protection extended, and she tended his injuries with the knowledge of plants and healing she had accumulated over 8 years of taking care of no one but herself. And she listened to everything he knew. Kale sat with her while she worked, and while the young wolf talked, and she could feel him processing the information with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, that deep and thorough absorption that came from a mind that had seen centuries of human patterning and knew how to read it. When the young wolf finally slept, exhausted and safe, Kale and Lyra sat across from each other in the thin mountain twilight and looked at each other and understood simultaneously that the comfortable learning period they had been occupying was over. "The Triad," she said. "Tell me what you know of them." She told him. It took a while because she had accumulated years of information from the margins, had watched the consolidation happening from the edges of it, had seen packs absorbed and reformed and their omegas redistributed as if they were livestock rather than beings with their own lives and bonds and personhoods. She told him about the public-facing justification, the promise of protection and stability and resources, and she told him about what she had seen underneath that justification, the systematic elimination of any institutional mechanism that might hold the alpha leadership accountable, the increasing legal and social restrictions on omegas specifically, the growing practice of what the Triad politely called consolidation bonds, arrangements made without consent in the language of destiny and the logic of what was good for the pack. Kale listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, his expression was the one she had begun to recognize as his processing face, the slight inward quality of someone whose attention has gone to a place that is deeper than the immediate environment. "I know this pattern," he said finally. "It is what I foresaw. It took longer than I expected, centuries longer, which means the corruption built more slowly and therefore more deeply. It is more entrenched than it would have been if it had happened faster." He looked at her. "This is going to be harder than the original framework." "Anticipated. Everything important is harder than anticipated," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "Generally. So what do we do?" she said. "And before you answer, I want to be clear that I am asking about strategy, not about destiny. I want to know what you think we should actually do, based on what we actually know, not what we were theoretically supposed to do according to a 350-year-old plan." He looked at her for a long moment. "The plan and the practical approach are not as different as you might hope," he said. "The bond is not just symbolic. If completed, it restructures the lunar channel in ways that affect every wolf in the region, not by force, not by overriding their own connections, but by reopening access to the direct channel that the pack system has been filtering for generations, allowing wolves who have been cut off from direct lunar connection to find it again. The Triad's authority is partly spiritual. That is, it depends on their position in the hierarchy that controls access to the moon's regard. If that hierarchy becomes irrelevant, because access is no longer mediated through it, he let that complete itself. Their power base collapses." Lyra finished. "Significantly weakens," he corrected. "They would still have material power. Resources, alliances, numbers. The spiritual disruption alone would not be sufficient, but it would create an opening that did not exist before. And the bond," she said carefully, "how does it complete?" He looked at her with the pre-dawn eyes, and she saw everything in them, the weight of centuries, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from having waited so long for something that now it is almost too large to hold. And underneath all of it, the absolute and unhurried patience of something that truly, genuinely meant what it said about her choice being her own. "Freely," he said, "fully knowingly, and in a moment when both of us want it without reservation. Because a primordial bond formed under any kind of pressure would be a weaker thing than no bond at all." She nodded. She looked away, into the trees, at the thin line of coming dark at the horizon. "I am not there yet," she said. "I know," he said. "Does that frustrate you?" "No," he said it without hesitation. "What would frustrate me is if you were anything other than what you are. You are the one the seal identified. That means your caution and your insistence on genuine choice are not obstacles to what needs to happen. They are part of why you are the one it needs to happen with." Lyra looked back at him. She had not been looked at that way before, as if the specific qualities that had made her life difficult were not flaws to be overcome, but specifications to be valued. It was a disorienting experience. She suspected it would take some time to become less disorienting. "We should go down," she said. "Not immediately, but we need to make contact with the packs the Triad hasn't absorbed yet. We need allies, and we need information, and we need to understand the full scope before we do anything that cannot be undone." "Yes," he said, with the tone of someone who has been thinking about going down for several weeks and has been very carefully not saying so. "You were waiting for me to suggest it," she said. "I was waiting until you were ready to suggest it," he said. "There is a difference." She considered this. "There is," she agreed. "All right. Let us figure out how to save the world then, or at least the northern region of it. We can start small." This time the smile reached his eyes. Part 7. The Descent. They brought the young wolf from Clan Morrow with them when they went down, partly because he needed to return to his family, and partly because he represented something potentially useful, a connection to a clan that had been targeted by the Triad, and might therefore be open to alliances that offered an alternative. His name was Pell, and he was 17. And once he was healed and fed and had spent several days in the Grey Mountains recalibrating to the reality of everything he had seen there, he became an asset of a specific kind. He was young enough to be adaptable and observant enough to be useful, and he had a particular gift that Lyra recognized immediately because she shared it in a different form. He listened well. The world below the mountain was significantly worse than Lyra had known from the margins of it, and she had not known it to be good. The Triad's consolidation had accelerated in the past year, and the territory that had been a patchwork of independent and semi-independent packs when she began living on the borderlands had become something more organized and more oppressive. 3 great clans, Stonevar, Brackenmoor, and Dusk Ridge, had formalized their alliance and installed themselves as what they called the Governing Council of the Northern Packs, a title that managed to imply both administrative legitimacy and military dominance simultaneously. They had rewritten the social codes, formalizing the Omega restrictions that had previously been informal and therefore at least inconsistently applied, creating a legal and institutional framework for the exploitation they had been practicing anyway. Several smaller packs had been absorbed by force. Others had been absorbed by desperation, their resources depleted by Triad pressure until joining was the only alternative to dissolution. A few held out independently, and it was to these that Lyra directed their first careful approach. She went alone at first. She left Kale in a location she had identified as defensible, and took Pell as her guide to the first of the independent packs, a small community called the Ash Circle, who had been maintaining their independence through a combination of geography and careful neutrality. She did not arrive making claims or demands. She arrived the way she had lived for 8 years, quietly and openly, offering information for information, honesty for honesty. The Ash Circle's alpha was a woman named Renner, perhaps 50 in wolf years, with the particular quality that Lyra had learned to identify as good leadership, which was the ability to listen to things that challenged her existing framework without immediately defensively reorganizing around the challenge. Renner heard Lyra's account of the Grey Mountains and of Kale with a stillness that suggested she was processing rather than dismissing, and at the end she asked the question that Lyra had prepared herself for and was still unprepared for in the specific form it took. "What does he want from us?" Renner said. "The Primordial. What does this cost us?" Lyra looked at her for a moment. "He wants to open the channel," she said. "Direct lunar access for every wolf who wants it. Not through any hierarchy, not mediated by any alpha's position. He believes that the Triad's power rests partly on their control of that access, and he believes that the restoration of direct access would significantly disrupt that control. He is asking for nothing from you except that you be willing to receive it." "And you," Renner said. "What do you want?" Lyra thought about it carefully. "I want the Omega restrictions dismantled," she said. "Not reformed, dismantled. I want formal legal mechanisms that make it impossible for pack leadership to make binding arrangements for their Omegas without those Omegas full and documented consent. I want accountability structures that do not favor alphas by design, and I want these things to happen regardless of what happens between me and the Primordial, because they are correct, regardless of any bond or no bond." She looked at Renner steadily. "I am not using the possibility of a primordial bond as leverage. I am telling you what I believe needs to happen, because I believe it needs to happen." Renner studied her for a long moment. "You are the wolf with the split crescent." "Mark," she said, "the elders in my grandmother's time talked about a bloodline that carried something old, something placed there deliberately." She paused. "They called it the moon-daughter line. Something moved through Lyra that she could not name." "I did not know it had a name," she said. "There are things that survive in the margins," Renner said, with the slight emphasis of someone who is also intimately familiar with the margins. "Things that the center thinks it has eliminated, but which continue in the places it does not look." She stood. "I will bring this to my elders. Return in 3 days. We will have an answer for you." The answer, 3 days later, was yes. They built the alliance carefully and slowly, over 6 weeks, and they did it from the outside in. Lyra approached each independent pack with the same honesty and the same clarity about what was being asked and what she was asking for in return. And Kale stayed at a respectful distance, not hidden, but not present in a way that could be read as pressure or intimidation. He understood, and she had explained clearly, that the weight of his presence required management, that wolves who had grown up in a world shaped by dominance hierarchies would instinctively read an unfamiliar dominant force as threat before they could read it as anything else, and that trust had to be built in a direction that moved toward him, rather than starting with him at the center. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he said so, without qualification. This was one of the things she was learning about him, that he did not defend positions out of pride when the evidence pointed to something different. He had 3 centuries to observe how attachment to positions in the absence of supporting evidence destroyed things. He was not attached to positions. He was attached to outcomes. The alliance that assembled itself over those 6 weeks was not the largest force in the Northern Territory. It was the most informed, the most internally coherent, and the most motivated, which historically tends to matter more than size in conflicts that are fundamentally about legitimacy rather than territory. They had 12 packs in formal agreement, representing perhaps 400 wolves, against the Triad's several thousand. But the Triad's several thousand included a very large number of wolves who had joined under duress or desperation, whose loyalty was conditional on the Triad's continued ability to provide what had been promised, and whose relationship to the spiritual authority the Triad claimed was about to become significantly more complicated. Kyle told her on the 43rd day since she had first run into his mountains that he was ready whenever she was. He said it in the morning, in the thin gold light of a sunrise that was particularly beautiful. And he said it without agenda, simply reporting a state of readiness as information for her use. And then he went back to explaining something about the geology of the mountain to Pell, who had become his shadow in the way that young things gravitate toward ancient things when the ancient thing makes itself accessible. Lyra stood in the gold light for a while after he said it, and let herself feel all of the things she had been feeling for 6 weeks, without forcing them into any shape before they were ready. The warmth that was his through the lunar channel, distinct now from the moon's own warmth, a particular signature she would have known with, her eyes closed and her ears covered. The fear that was not the fear of something threatening, but the fear of something so important that the possibility of losing it was itself enormous. The certainty, growing daily, that what she had said to Renner about wanting change regardless of what happened between her and the Primordial was true, and not the whole truth simultaneously, that she wanted the change. And she wanted him. She sat with it for the rest of the day, and through the evening, and through the night of the dark moon, sitting outside alone and talking to the sky the way she always had. And the warmth that came back was both vast and close, both ancient and immediate, and it said, in the wordless language that she had been fluent in since she was 8 years old, that she had always been enough, that she had always been known, that the waiting had never been about her inadequacy. It had been about the worlds. Part 8. The Bond. She found him near the thermal vents in the mountain's heart, sitting in the way that he sat sometimes, very still and very present, like a thing that has no urgency because it exists in a different relationship with time. The fire reflected in the pre-dawn eyes and made them warmer, more gold than gray, and he looked up when she arrived without surprise because he had known she was coming the way he knew most things about her now. "I am ready," she said. He stood. He did it slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who has learned that his size and presence are things to be managed thoughtfully, and he looked at her across the small distance between them with everything visible in his face, the waiting and the caring and the particular loneliness of something that has hoped for a very long time, and underneath all of it, unmistakably, the determination to honor whatever she said. "You are certain," he said, not doubting, confirming. "I am certain that I want this," she said. "I am uncertain about everything else. I do not know if we will succeed. I do not know what the bond will feel like or what it will demand. I do not know if I will be adequate to what comes next." She looked at him. "I know that I have spent 8 years being adequate when adequacy was all I was allowed to reach for. And I think it is time to find out what I am capable of when I reach for something that matters." He crossed the distance between them, slowly, with the care he always used, and he stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the physical world, separate from the lunar channel warmth. Heat generated by a body that processed the world at a scale that exceeded its own containment. He raised a hand and held it, palm up, between them. An offering, not a demand. She put her hand in his. The warmth came from everywhere simultaneously. From his hand, from the ground, from the sky she could not see through the mountain stone, from the mark on her shoulder blade that had been waiting since she was born, from the lunar channel that had been carrying them toward each other for as long as either of them could remember. It did not hurt. She had expected something that hurt, some dramatic agony of transformation, and instead what she felt was the opposite of pain. The feeling of tension releasing from a place you had not known was tense. The feeling of a weight lifting that you had been carrying so long, you had forgotten it was not simply the natural weight of existing. The bond settled into place between them like a conversation finding its true register, like two voices discovering the harmony they had been approximating for years. She felt him, his age and his patience and his grief, and his hope, and the specific quality of his caring that was enormous and careful simultaneously. And she felt him feel her fear, and her courage, and her anger, and her love, and the fierceness with which she had survived everything the world had offered her. She saw his face change. For a moment, only a moment. She saw what he looked like when nothing was being managed, when the careful deliberateness that he wore like an instrument of courtesy was simply not present, and what was underneath it was the most genuinely moved thing she had ever seen on any face. He breathed out slowly, slowly, like something held for centuries finally releasing, and he said her name in a voice that was different from any voice she had heard, even from him. And she understood that her name in E. That voice was something that only existed in this specific combination of people in this specific moment. "Hello," she said softly, which was absurd. But he laughed, a real sound, surprised and warm, and it filled the mountain chamber and was the most beautiful sound she had heard in her life. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and the moon above them, through all that stone, sent down warmth like approval. Part 9. The Reckoning. They went to the Triad 7 days after the bond. Lyra went first again, and she went openly, entering the governing council's territory at its most formal point, the central meeting ground of Clan Stonevar, requesting an audience in the legally recognized form that the Triad's own social codes required them to honor. The codes required them to receive any wolf requesting formal audience, because the codes had been written to look just enough like law to be credible. An appearance of legitimacy required at least some actual structure. They received her. In the great hall that Stonevar had built over the past decade, a deliberate display of wealth and permanence, designed to communicate that power here was settled and architectural rather than provisional. 3 alphas sat in an arrangement that was clearly meant to read as thrones, and the room around them was full of wolves whose physical positioning communicated various things about their relationship to the Triad's power. Lyra stood in the center of the room and looked at the 3 alphas and was aware, distantly, of how she must appear to them. Small, unaffiliated by any visible marker. Without the backing of any pack structure they could quantify. A woman who had been a reject from a minor clan for 8 years, and who was therefore, from their perspective, about as significant as the heir she displaced. She let them look for a moment. Then she pulled her collar aside and showed them the mark on her shoulder, the split crescent that caught the light of the hall's fires with a silver luminescence that should not have been possible from the skin of a living body, and she watched their faces. The oldest of the three, the Stonevar patriarch, had been told what the mark meant, and had not believed it until this moment. She saw the disbelief and the recognition arrive simultaneously in his face, and understood that some part of him had known this was coming, had feared it, had built all of this architecture of consolidation partly as a defense against it. "The Moon Daughter line," he said, and his voice was very controlled. "I came to make you an offer," Lyra said. "And before you decide how to respond to the offer, I want you to notice something." She paused. "The bond has been completed. The lunar channel is open. Not in this room necessarily, not yet, but in the territory around it. In the territories of 12 packs who have already chosen to receive it. Your wolves can feel it. Right now, whether you acknowledge it or not, whether any of you in this room choose to participate or not." She looked at them steadily. "Your authority has always rested partly on controlling access to the moon's regard through the hierarchy you maintain. That specific foundation has changed. The question now is what you would like to build on what remains." The middle of the three, the Brackenmore matriarch, spoke with the careful precision of someone who has survived long enough to know when a position has shifted irrevocably. "You came to make an offer," she said. "Make it." "Dissolution of the formal Omega restrictions," Lyra said. "All of them. Replaced by a charter of protections that guarantees full legal personhood and consent rights to every wolf regardless of secondary nature. Accountability structures for pack leadership that are not subject to override by alpha authority. Freedom of movement and association. And an independent council with genuine enforcement capacity, comprising equal representation from all secondary natures that oversees compliance. And if we do not accept," the Stonevar patriarch said, "then we do not need your acceptance," Lyra said simply. "The bond is complete regardless of what you decide in this room. The channel is open regardless. What I am offering you is the opportunity to be part of building something better, rather than spending whatever authority you have left trying to resist something that cannot be resisted." She paused. "I am not interested in punishing you. I am interested in the world that exists after today. I would prefer that world to include your constructive participation in it. But it will exist without your participation if that is what you choose." The silence in the great hall was the kind that has weight. Something shifted in it, and she felt it before she heard it. A change in the quality of the air. A warmth that moved through the stone walls and the fires and the bodies of every wolf in the room as the lunar channel expanded into new territory, finding the beings who had been waiting for it even while lacking the vocabulary for what they were waiting for. She watched wolves in that room feel something they had not felt before, or had felt faintly at a distance, through the filter of hierarchy, and now felt directly. And she watched their faces change with it. Not all of them. Several of the higher-ranking wolves near the 3 alphas had expressions that suggested the feeling was unwelcome, too much like losing something they had built their identity around, possessing exclusively. But the others, the ones further from the center of power, the ones who had been existing within the structure without fully benefiting from it, she watched them, and she thought about being 8 years old on a rock in the dark, and the warmth that had answered. She thought everyone deserved to feel that warmth. The Brackenmore matriarch stood. She was the first of the 3 to move, and she moved toward Lyra with the deliberateness of someone making a choice that they have already fully inhabited, rather than still deciding. And she stopped before her and said, "Where do we begin?" The Duskridge Alpha followed within a minute. The Stonevar patriarch took longer. He sat for a while with the expression of someone dismantling something that had been load-bearing in their understanding of themselves, which was harder than simply conceding a political position. He sat with it, and Lyra did not hurry him because she understood the difference between someone resisting and someone processing, and this was processing. When he finally stood, He looked older than he had when she came in, and more real, and he said, "My Pax Omegas will need formal apologies. Not statements, apologies." "Yes," Lyra said. "They will." He nodded. "Then yes," he said. Part 10. What comes after. The next year was harder than the reckoning. Lyra would tell anyone who asked, and many people asked, that the moment in the Great Hall was real and meaningful, and changed the Aosap direction of things irrevocably. She would also tell them that direction change is not the same as arrival, and that the work of building the structures she had described to the Triad was the kind of work that does not have a dramatic resolution point, that continues past any single moment of victory, into the long and often frustrating project of making new things function in a world where old things have deeper roots. The charter she had proposed became a real document after months of negotiation between representatives of every pack in the Northern Territory, including the Triad packs, including the independent packs that had formed the alliance, including 3 packs that had been absorbed by the Triad, and who now, with the balance of power shifted, had room to voice what their absorption had cost them. It was not a perfect document. It was a living one, contested in places where honest disagreement existed, and vague in places where no one yet had the experience to know what the right specificity was. It was real, and it was a beginning. The independent council took shape slowly, with all of the difficulty that genuine representation always involves, which is the difficulty of making sure that the people who have historically had the least power in a system are not simply added decoratively to a new structure that continues to center the same interests. Lyra sat on the council in the capacity that the bond made natural, as a connection between the council's work and the lunar channel, and she did the work of that sitting with the same stubbornness and honesty that she had brought to everything else. She was not perfectly diplomatic. She did not have a talent for the kind of diplomatic softening that allows difficult things to be said without the full weight of their difficulty landing on the listener. She had a talent for clarity and for refusing to accept comfortable replacements for actual solutions, and she surrounded herself with people whose skills were different from hers and listened to them seriously. Cale learned the world he had woken into. This was, he told her once, in the dark of a night when the mountains were quiet, and they were sitting with their backs against the oldest tree in his territory and watching the stars. This was the thing he had been least prepared for. Not the political complexity, not the human-scale difficulty of the reform work, not even the specific adjustments of learning to exist at a proximity to other beings that 3.5 centuries of solitude had made unfamiliar. He had been least prepared for how attached he would become to specific people. To Pell, who was 18 by then, and had become something between an apprentice and a younger brother, who was learning everything Cale would teach him about the pre-hierarchy world, and finding ways to translate it into the vocabulary of the present, and who had a gift for the kind of teaching that made things feel exciting rather than obligatory. To Renner of the Ash Circle, who had become one of the council's most effective voices, and who regularly arrived at Cale's Mountain to argue with him about historical interpretations of the Primordial's role, and who was right often enough that he had stopped finding it surprising. To the wolves he had not known existed 350 years ago, and who now were real to him, specific and detailed and irreplaceable in the way that all beings become irreplaceable when you know them well enough. He told her all of this one night, and she listened, and she thought about being alone in the northern forest for 8 years, and talking to the sky, and she put her head on his shoulder, and felt the warmth of the bond, and the warmth of the man, and the warmth of the moon above, and she said, "It is good to belong somewhere." He rested his cheek against her hair. "Yes," he said, "it is." Epilogue. The whisper and the answer. 5 years after the night Lyra ran into the gray mountains, a young wolf climbed to the highest point she could find in the northern forest, sat down in the dark, and whispered her loneliness to the sky. She was 12 years old, and she was not the right secondary nature, or so her packmates had begun to say, because she was not a clear omega or alpha or beta, but something that fell between the categories, and the social discomfort that followed this assessment was the first of what would likely be many. She had not heard of Lyra Ashvale yet, though she would, because the stories of the Moon Daughter and the Primordial Wolf were already becoming the kind of stories that were told to wolf pups. Not as warnings, but as possibilities. What she felt, when she whispered into the dark, was warmth, vast and patient, and impossibly gentle. And underneath it, new and added to the original warmth, something that was distinctly human in character. The particular warmth of someone who has been exactly where you are and found a way through. She did not know what to make of it yet. She sat with it in the dark and breathed and let it be what it was. The moon above her and the bond below it held her the way they held everything that whispered honestly into the night, with the particular care of something ancient that has been listening for a very long time and intends to listen for a very long time more. In the gray mountains, Lyra felt the channel carry the young wolf's voice the way the channel had always carried her own, and she smiled. In the dark, and whispered back, wordlessly, in the only language that had ever felt entirely native to her. The young wolf, 12 years old and sitting on her highest point, felt a warmth that was new and close and said, without words, that she was known. She would be all right. They all would. Thank you so much for being here, dear listeners, from the very first whisper to the very last warmth. If this story moved you, if Lyra's courage or Kale's patience found something in you that needed to be found, please leave this video a like and share it with someone who would love to hear it. Tell me in the comments what this story meant to you, what you will carry from it, and whether you want to see more stories in this world, because there are more stories here. There are always more stories in a world, this full of wolves who talk to the moon, and moons that listen back. Subscribe if you have not yet, because we bring you new supernatural romance stories every single week. And I promise you that every single one of them is made with the same love and the same intention as this one. Until next time, dear listeners, keep whispering. Something enormous is always listening.